Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for tuning into one of our talks today. We are a year-round talk series bringing you the best creative voices across film, television, and theater. And today we're incredibly lucky to be joined by the fantastic writer-director Noah Hutton with his film Lapsis. And I also wanted to congratulate you on the Independent Spirit Award nomination for Best First Screenplay before we dive in.
Thank you. I'm very surprised and delighted. It was a wonderful piece of news to get.
Yeah, well, congratulations. And to that point, I actually wanted to dive in first by talking a little bit about the screenplay writing process, because one of the things that the script and the film as a whole does so successfully is you've taken this whole idea of creating a real kind of social commentary, a commentary around the way corporations treat employers, but you've done it in such a way that it's really channeled through this character study and feels very engaging, which can be challenging to balance those two aspects out. So I was curious about the journey in writing the screenplay and finding that way to make sure that you were getting across the messaging that you really wanted and having a lot of that information and detail come through. But at the end of the day, really making sure that the focus stays on this central character of Ray and the people around him.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's difficult both in science fiction, I think, in two directions. On one hand, when you're doing science fiction, there's a tendency to need to over-explain sometimes the science, the world in which you've thrust your viewers into. So in this case, the film deals with a quantum computing boom. So one of the traps, I think, was like over-explaining the quantum of it all. But I knew pretty clearly from the beginning of writing the script that I wanted this to be what I like to call a blue-collar science fiction story, in that it's focused on how that science and technology has trickled down to affect working people, like let's say 5 or 10 years after some big breakthrough was made, right? So at that juncture, I think there's a second trap, which I think you touched on, which is, well, then, you could get too didactic with the politics of it all, the working class struggle and the issues that you're trying to point at in terms of the gig economy and the exploitation by a sort of tech monopoly in the film. And I guess my solution to that, or to try to find, I guess there is no solution, but just to try to find a balance, was to really write a character, in the character of Ray, played by Dean Imperial, who doesn't necessarily come into the story with strong politics of his own, nor does he know anything about the science technology, really. He really is an everyman, and very much like our central character in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, who kind of wakes up and the world has moved past him. I think Ray has a similar experience where the world has become quantum and he has no idea what has happened. And he also gets initiated to the politics later in the story when he gets out into the forest. So the audience then hopefully can really ride the wave with this character who isn't presumed to know more than they do at any point in time.
And then you also take it to that even deeper level where it does have that real focus on the gig economy within the film, but you also use it as a larger commentary, and I've heard you talk a little bit about even just the way in which large corporations are getting rid of permanent full-time positions and bringing in independent contractors. And you really managed to filter that into the film as well. So how did you think about the conversation that you wanted to have as the central focus of the film, and then how to turn it into a much bigger, wider conversation at the same time as well?
Yeah, I think we are dealing in this film in kind of allegorical terrain. Lapsis does not take place in a real sector of the current gig economy. So in dealing with allegory, it did allow us to point at things that are going on today, not just in the gig economy, but even more broadly speaking. I've never worked in the gig economy, but I've spent a decade as a sort of independent contractor freelancer. So that was my context for it. I had a lot I wanted to say about the way in which many of these companies and many monopolies are, as you say, getting rid of full-time employees to make everyone an independent contractor, then also stymieing any efforts at unionization, firing their union employees and then rehiring people who are independent contractors. So I wanted to comment on a lot of things, but I wanted to have it happen as naturally as possible through characters in a real setting, in a world that should feel real, coming into contact with characters like the character of Anna in the film, played by Madeline Wise, who knows more than they do potentially about all of this and can sort of bring them into the struggle. But I definitely think that there's a way in which we get hyped up and we glamorize these tech utopias that were being sold by Silicon Valley, and then 5 or 10 years later, there's some ugly truths that need to be dealt with. And so this film, I think, explores what might happen in a world in which quantum computing has taken over.
And within that realness that you create, one of the really smart choices that you've crafted into the film is creating it in a parallel present. So it doesn't feel like it's 50 years in the future, and there's aesthetics and technology that you bring in that is very close to what already exists in our world. And, you know, we physically could imagine kind of turning around and seeing that in a store at any point. And at the same time, there's also visual elements in terms of some of the video production that feels a little bit 90s and a little bit more retro. And so it's quite fascinating because it's really effusive on where and when it actually physically takes place because of those aspects. So what was the reason for thinking about having both the retro feel and a slight future feel, as well as kind of creating it in a version of the present at the same time?
Yeah, you're right on. The aesthetics of in terms of our production design, much of our costume, our wardrobe design too, was retro futuristic, and there's, I think, one way in which that functions is just to make it feel as if the world has been lived in to a degree. So a lot of the set pieces that we have out in the woods were meant to feel like they're kind of broken down a bit. Moss has grown on them. They're a little dirty. And then the overall aesthetics of the robots in the films are not meant to be the flashy humanoid or dog-like robots that we see in viral videos today. They're meant to feel like they're kind of from a generation ago. And that was, I think, that plus the futurism of quantum was intentionally made to kind of destabilize where this world was existing. So it's neither meant to feel like the late 90s nor the future. And that's what you said the parallel present, and that's exactly it. We wanted this to feel like it had elements of both, so that you kind of feel still somehow weirdly in between, but definitely not are in between.
Yeah. And with the robots as well, I think you did such a fantastic job, you know, particularly because you're not using CGI, you actually physically have them within the space. And, you know, it must have been such a challenge to have them move around wooded forests. But I heard that you actually worked with an educational institution and was really fascinated by the journey of how that came into place, because budget wise, that meant it didn't cost you anything to have robots in your movie because they created it as an academic project. But also I was curious about the conversations that you had with them in terms of just visually what you needed to make sure it was still a fit with your film and what you wanted to present on screen at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I come from also a documentary background, and I've been working on this other project for a long time about neuroscience, a documentary called In Silico, which is also coming out. And I think from that work, I've been filming at so many science labs over the years that I just had the sense that, you know, although my film's not really about robotics, that documentary, I knew that at many of these institutions I'd gone to and interviewed neuroscientists at, there were robotics labs like next door, and they were, you know, working on things that I really wanted to use in this film. So we went to UPenn and we found a robotics lab that had the perfect kind of base for the robot that we wanted aesthetically, like we were just talking about, something that felt maybe one generation removed from the current fad, right? And it's not even what they work on right now. Like they have these robots that we ended up using were their last generations. They kind of took them out of the closet for us, and they made this a summer program for 3 or 4 of their robotics like doctoral students, and sent them up to our set, and they got credit for their program by being on set and controlling the robotics. So as you said, we didn't have to budget this in at all. It was worked into their program. We fed them and housed them, but they were wonderful to work with. We went down there a couple of times to collaborate on the design. Like we saw what they could give us. We prototyped that. We got it into some sort of 3D printing environment. I mean, my production designer is wonderful, so he really did this. And we built the top of them with the little instruments that come out. So we customized them to a degree. And then, you know, we didn't really have so much control over the process because they were unpaid and they were coming on their own time. So a little bit of this was up to chance. Like they arrived and we didn't really have like a lot of testing time or anything like that. So, but that kind of like chance quality is so wonderfully exhilarating on indie film shoots. You just kind of, you just hope that enough sort of like, you know, luck moves in your favor, and you know, turn on the cameras and for us with the robotics, it really just worked. They controlled them, they worked. And so for an indie film, that's kind of like a godsend.
Right. And you filmed almost the entire film outdoors and managed to go through an entire film shoot without it ever raining out a full day. But what was the contingency planning that you had in place in case that happened, especially on such a tight shoot?
We desperately couldn't afford any rain during the robotics. We had 4 days of robots, and we couldn't, if we'd gotten rained out of one day of the robotics, we really didn't have a contingency plan. We would have had to, you know, I'm sure you have to always find something, right? But we just really didn't have a plan for not getting the robotic stuff. So we got lucky with that. We got rained out half of one day that was not a robotics day. And we moved one scene into a tent, you know, so we had a backup plan that often involved putting people in tents inside a room, and then, like, you know, having lighting effects and so forth to make it feel like the moonlight was hitting the tent. So, you know, those were some of our backup plans, but the robots were really just straight luck.
And you were mentioning before documentary filmmaking, which is the world in which you come from, and this is your first narrative feature. And I think it's so interesting the parallels of skills that come into the way that you tell a story, and particularly when you look at the way that you've chosen to tell this film, where, you know, it really kind of moves with the characters. The camera choices that you make really follow kind of the lead that they're creating on screen. And so I wanted to ask about the way in which documentary filmmaking and the way that you made camera choices in that realm really influenced and impacted a lot of the choices that you made for this.
That's a great question. I mean, I've shot all my documentaries myself, and I think the shooting method, the shooting style in those films can be pretty different. This is the first, like, time I've really collaborated on a deep level with a DP who brought in, you know, a lot of his own aesthetic and style to the project, which I was grateful for. I wore a lot of hats on this project, but cinematography was one that I didn't want to, you know, own. I really wanted to collaborate with someone who we could meet, you know, in the middle on a style. And that happened with Mike Gomes, the DP. But there are other things with documentary filmmaking that I do feel really had an impact on this film as far as my background. And I think the main way that worked for me is, like, a lot of people talk about this idea of world building in sci-fi. Like, you have to set up this, you know, if you're not in the present, you have to somehow build a world anew, tell the audience what the rules are and what the, you know, cause and effect is in this world you've created. So to that effect, I think documentary filmmaking was super valuable to have a background in that, because I think when you go around making a documentary, you're often looking for shots and snippets and of verite and all sorts of hints that you can drop in the film as to what the world you're trying to document is saying, and what you want to show about that world. So for Lapsis, I often thought, like, what would be the one moment, like, for example, the characters go to an expo. What would I like to see if I was shooting this as a doc? What would I have selected from this busy world that we've created and put in motion? And that kind of mindset of, what if I was capturing this to try to world build in a documentary, really translated directly, I think, to narrative filmmaking.
And were there parallels as well in terms of how you would you would film or talk to documentary subjects in terms of how you relate to your actors and create a space for them? Because no matter what the medium, it's really all about reading the room, reading someone's energy, feeling what it is that they need from you as a director to feel comfortable kind of revealing themselves and being vulnerable in front of the camera and not thinking about the fact that they're in front of the camera. So what were the parallels in terms of documentary subjects or interviews and then actors on set for this?
Yeah, totally. You can in documentary interviewing, you know, you are trying to create a comfortable space for someone to be themselves truly. You know, I think there are different types of documentary directing, maybe when you're trying to manipulate a little more, but in the kind that I like to do, you really are going for truth, and you're trying to get rid of some of the anxiety that people, you know, understandably feel in front of cameras. And you can, as the interviewer, I think the more you do it, the more you are attuned to what a moment of truth in an interview. You can tell, I hope, you know, I hope you as the interviewer here have felt like I'm giving you my truth. I feel like, but you can feel it as the interviewer. You know, you can tell when someone is tight or performing something for you versus giving it to you as it is. So very much, very similar in working with actors. It's a sense of, do I feel like this human being has taken the dialogue and moved it through their humanity as opposed to an idea of what they think they need to do for the camera. And those two things can be very different. I think it's very similar to getting an answer from someone in a documentary interview that they think they need to give you to like do well in the interview. The same alarm bell goes off in your head. So I definitely felt that in working with actors.
Yeah. And I definitely wanted to talk about Dean Imperial, excellent name, by the way, who plays the main character of Ray, because he's, he's not an actor first and foremost. He's actually a writer that you'd seen in a reading and you just really saw something in him that you felt was right. And I love the fact that you kind of were so adamant about having him in the film, even when people were telling you that you needed to have someone who was a slightly more recognizable name, that it was going to be more of a challenge to fund the film. But what was it that you saw in that moment in that reading that made you feel that he was going to understand this character and inhabit him in a way that nobody else would?
Yeah, absolutely. I saw Dean in that reading, but it was when I was thinking about him as Ray, and even when people, like you mentioned, would poke at me a little bit when we were trying to raise money for this movie and say, haven't you thought about like just more of a name in this role, because we could maybe get it funded that way, whatever. The thing I would come back to in my head was not so much from that reading as I've been friends with Dean for years. So it was years of sitting across from him when we, get together in New York to catch up. And there's a way in which Dean has always felt to me like he's not really of the present moment. He's a little bit from both the parallel present, but also potentially like from the past. He's sort of like from another era, truly. And so that's one element of like his ethos. It's hard to put words on. It's just sort of a vibe you get from someone. But yes, in the reading, I could tell that Dean has chops. Like he could act. He just hasn't pursued it. And everyone around him in his life, believes that too. And they think Dean is like a great unsung actor who just hasn't gone for it. So I just had faith in him, and I can't even articulate it. It's just sort of like I knew through and through in my gut that Dean would be a great leading man for this film.
And I really love visually the aesthetic that you came up with as a character. And there's even kind of that joke and nod to the fact that he almost looks like a 70s American gangster within the film. And there's just little things like having one too many buttons undone on his shirt, the kind of like necklace that he wears at all times, the way that he has his hair slicked back. So why did you so specifically want to create that particular aesthetic for this character?
Well, to be quite honest with you, it's not so far from Dean's IRL persona. So I would love to take credit for like taking this guy who's like clean cut and wears suits every day and like putting him in an unbuttoned shirt, wife beater with like a chain and like greasy. But I didn't have to like envision much. Let's just put it that way. I mean, we did. You always have to build a character on top of someone's real life personas. So I don't want to. It's but we really did capture a degree of Dean as Dean.
And as well as writing and directing the film, you also took on some other positions, including editing the film, which I think as a filmmaker must be really useful to a degree, particularly when you're working on such a fast shoot with these sorts of constraints, because there's potentially an ability as you're filming to start putting together a rough cut version in your head and start imagining exactly what it is that you're going to need. So did that lead to certain choices in terms of camera setups that you wanted, coverage that you felt you needed to get, just already being able to start knowing what you were going to need in post-production in your mind?
Yeah, you're totally right with that. Knowing that I was going to edit the film, and because I've spent most of my like freelance life as an editor, that's kind of how I've made my living all these years, and to get to a place to make this film, the editing mindset is near and dear to me. So I was absolutely shooting for the edit. And that was useful when time is a constraint and weather is a threat, to know what exact shots I would want for the edit if I were to be editing this film, was a helpful, way to approach each scene, I think. And then the music sort of, came in as a step later in the process. I wasn't really thinking about that during production. I didn't necessarily do it just to save us time or money, but I'd be very open to working with a composer in the future. And I don't need to control those elements per se, but I definitely, in this case, my first time out as a writer director, because those are parts of the process I enjoy and can do, I really did want to do them this time at least.
Well, the music composition which you've created is so fantastic in the way that it never feels like it's taking you out of the moment. It feels like it really is there to evolve and enhance each of these moments within it. And I've heard you talk a little bit about how one of the challenges in making a feature versus a short was that in a short it's much easier to find the tone because it's a little bit more singular, but obviously there's so many different layers of this. So I wanted to ask a little bit about how the music composition really lent itself to that ability to find such a multitude of tones within the film.
Yeah, that was honestly one of the most difficult things for me in this project. As my first narrative film was the balancing act of tones, and in realizing at a certain point that this script I'd written that were then making was fitting into the sci-fi genre, which there are like genre cues, and this was all fairly new for me. I hadn't really made an exact short version of this film and this tone before either to start. So it was really forging out kind of into the unknown tonally and then finding it as we went. And the music was, as with many other elements of the story, I found that I could access what I needed by thinking of what Ray as a character was going through. So that sort of like held true for so many elements of the story. So in the early parts of the film, when he's not been yanked out into this forest world yet, there's some older jazz elements that are sort of like eerily floating through the score. As we get out into the quantum world, the score gets a little more synth based and maybe more of those sci-fi genre cues. And so, and that's as Ray is encountering that world. So I basically filtered it back through the idea of character to try to stay rooted in something with the score, but it was certainly like a trial and error process in post-production.
And with that idea of sci-fi cues throughout the film as a whole and all of the different elements, what was the journey of determining where you really wanted to include them, where it felt like a necessary addition to the film, and the moments that you felt like you could break away from it and didn't really need to kind of lean into the sci-fi element as much?
Yeah, I think anytime we saw our set pieces out in the woods, like these big quantum transistors, the big metal cubes, anytime we saw robotics for the first time, those kind of introductions as like these physical objects as characters, I wanted to try to give some sci-fi genre cues in the score for sure. Anytime we were dealing more with Ray as a person in Queens and then going into the forest, that was a little less important to me. And I relied a little bit on more of my experience of like scoring documentaries and just kind of giving it like a human element, just trying to connect with some kind of emotion. And, the peak drama points later in the film when Ray confronts a robot, we'll just say, was a nice, I think, marriage of the two, where I could bring in some of the sci-fi and more human emotional scoring and kind of marry them a little bit more.
It's so amazing the number of skill sets that you've had the opportunity to develop that really came into play for this film. But on the flip side, what did you find were the biggest learning curves that you were still facing in making this project?
Yeah, we just mentioned one that is a huge one, which is the balancing of tones. It was, in documentary you can definitely move through different tones in a documentary, but I would say that this film, it was an entirely new way of presenting tones, resolving them. The arcs were very different for me to work with than in documentary arcs, so that was challenging for me. The other challenging element, which I had prepared for a bit by working in the commercial world a little bit in New York, like directing some commercials and being in that space a little bit, was working with bigger crews and just being in a more collaborative environment. The documentary work can be very lone wolf as far as the way I was making many of my documentaries, maybe 2 or 3 people at most working together, but often just me out in the field. So going from that model to working with, from pre-production, a large team of designers, and then out in the, on a cruise where we were sometimes upwards of 25, 30 people, with half an hour left before the sun sets, looking to me to decide what shots to kill and which one to go for. Those were intense moments to be in, but I asked for it. I mean, of course, this is all my doing. So I was glad to be in those positions and lucky to be surrounded by great people. Sometimes, regretting the decision I made, but I think most of the time, working together to find something that ended up working for us. So it was trial by fire, and I think next time out I'll have a lot more experience in my pocket, hopefully.
Yeah. Well, the film as a whole is such a remarkable achievement. So congratulations on all of that, and thank you so much for taking time today.
Thank you so much, Mara. I really appreciate it. Great questions.